The Sightless. Megan sat in the plush armchair beside the window and watched the streets. A number of figures had passed within the last half hour. They had moved out and faded back onto the mist like phantoms, never lingering. Even though the streets was empty, she didn't dare relax. Seeing her town so quiet was surreal. There's no more dogs left to bark. No car horns blared. None of her neighbors argued or started their lawnmowers, even though it was Sunday morning. At least, she thought it was Sunday morning. She was starting to lose track. Taj approached from behind. He'd shed his shoes in favor of layered socks, and she wasn't aware of him until he leaned over her shoulder and passed her a note. "Is it safe to open the can?" Megan slipped a pen out of her pocket and wrote back, "I think so. Haven't seen any for a few minutes." Taj nodded and returned to the kitchen, his padded feet making no more noise than Megan's heartbeat. This was important. In this new world, the world of Sightless, noise equaled death. No one was completely sure where they'd come from. The earliest news reports, the ones that made it through before the media blackout, said they'd poured out of the mines that had gone too deep. A few people called them aliens, though that was an unpopular phrase, as they'd come from inside the earth. Others called them demons, but they had very little in common with the demons she'd been raised to believe in. Megan and her two companions, Taj and Lisa, called them sightless. They couldn't see, they couldn't smell, though they somehow seemed quite comfortable navigating the suburban neighborhood. The only way they could find their prey, humans, was through sound. Megan didn't know how many people were still alive in her street, possibly none. Before the media blackout, before the creatures had rushed through her town like a deadly wave, there had been stories of entire cities being overrun. She hadn't had any of her neighbors for more than a day. She was lucky. She knew her parents had been preppers. That hadn't saved them from the sightless, though. But at least it ensured Megan's pantry was filled with cans of lifelong food and 5-liter jugs of water. This was enough to keep Taj, herself, and Lisa alive for a few weeks. "There damn well better be a rescue before those weeks are up." She had no idea how the rest of the world was faring. For all she knew, the military was deploying weapons against the sightless at that very moment. On the other hand, humanity might have been all but destroyed and reduced to little pockets of survivors like Megan's house. Not speaking, walking with silent care, terrified that at any moment a sneeze or cough could force their hand. Megan glanced behind herself to where Taj had taken a large can of beans out of the cupboard. Lisa stood leaning on the counter, her long tan hair hiding half of her face. While Taj was a lifelong friend, Megan didn't know much about Lisa, only that she'd stumbled into their house one night the sightless had invaded, and was grateful they'd allowed her to stay with them. Taj eased the can's ring up, then began tugging the lid free of its seal with slow, gentle motions. Opening cans was always a risk. Somehow, they were perfectly silent, but other times, the metal whined. They tried to reduce their risk by waiting until there wasn't any sightless in the streets, but mist had rolled through that morning and reduced Megan's visibility to less than a dozen feet. Taj had the lid halfway off when it let out a high-pitched squeal. He froze, and his eyes bugged. Megan rose to her feet, stared at the window, praying there hadn't been any sightless close to hear. One of the creatures slunk through the mist, its eyeless, noseless face turned toward her window. A second followed not far behind. Megan couldn't even breathe the swear word that hung on her tongue. The window's glass had been broken out on the night of the invasion. Megan's parents had tried to fight back. Their bodies were gone, but the blood would never come out of the walls. Megan took an involuntary step backward, holding her breath, praying her heartbeat wouldn't be audible. The first Sightless stepped so easily over the window sill. Its long, leathery, gray legs were as silent as Megan wished her human limbs could be. It passed her so closely that she could smell the decaying flesh and its tainted breath. Its mouth, a long gash covering the otherwise empty, tapered face, opened a fraction, exposing its off-white teeth on the inside. It moved through the house with deceptive slowness. Megan had seen how quickly they could run when they pinpointed a sound. Faster than a cheetah. The Sightless climbed over the sill. Megan realized its trajectory meant it would bump into her. She took a careful step to her left. For a moment, she was afraid that, even with her feet double layer in thick socks, she'd been too fast and make a noise. The Sightless hesitated for a second, its head tilted in her direction, then continued toward the kitchen. Taj was sweating and shaking. He'd left the can on the counter and held his hands at his side, in a pose they discovered best to stop shifting clothing noises. He stared straight ahead, his lips clenched shut, as a Sightless wove towards him. Holding his breath, the drops of sweat beaded over his face. He's frightened. They'll hear his heart. Megan squeezed her eyes closed, unwilling to watch as the Sightless homed in on her friend. The shattering glass in a building across the street broke the silence. The Sightless froze for a fraction of a second. Then both turned and shot through the room as gray blurs. It passed so near Megan that she felt the wind ruffle her hair. The creature leaped through the window and crossed the street in 2 paces as they raced towards the unfortunate soul who had been careless enough to make a noise. Megan finally inhaled, drawing breath into her starving lungs, and turned towards the kitchen. Taj had both hands pressed over his face and was shivering. As their unknown neighbor's screams rose into a terrified, agonized wail, Lisa picked up the half-open can and offered a spoonful to Megan. She tried to return the grim smile and scooped a spoonful of beans. She was practical enough to know there would be no safer time to eat than when any noises were masked by her neighbor's screams.